$20 billion shock, which at first seemed like just another headline in the economic defense section, has turned out to be powerful enough to shake the long-standing alliance between the United States and Canada. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a technical decision. Ottawa needs to replace its aging Victoria-class submarines, which can hardly meet combat requirements anymore. Yet, once $20 billion in defense spending is placed on the table, those figures suddenly transform into sharp blades cutting straight into trust and shared interests. The image of Canada and the U.S. standing shoulder to shoulder within NATO, the bedrock of North Atlantic security for decades, suddenly appears fragile, all because of a weapons contract. In international politics, fractures rarely begin with monumental decisions, but rather with details that seem harmless. This time, a submarine procurement deal has laid bare deeper questions. Who truly controls the flow of economic and security interests among allies? Who gets to decide what Canada buys, where it is built, and whose pockets the profits will line? For Washington, it's about jobs, tens of thousands of workers in the defense industry. For Ottawa, it's a test of sovereignty. Can Canada chart its own strategic course without being pressured? And for the world, it's proof that a new era has begun, an era where even the closest of friends can clash over industrial interests. But to understand why Canada would dare to choose such a risky path, we must return to the very beginning, the Victoria-class submarines, symbols of an outdated legacy. Purchased secondhand from Britain in the late 1990s, these vessels have not only exposed technical shortcomings, but also revealed the fragility of Canada's defense strategy. And it is precisely from these aging submarines that the $20 billion story began. Looking back at history, the Victoria-class submarines were never truly a source of pride for the Canadian Navy. They were purchased from the United Kingdom in 1998 at a time when even London considered them vessels at the end of their useful lives. These submarines, never designed for long-term missions in the Arctic or across vast oceans, were merely a stopgap solution during a period when Canada lacked the resources to invest in new builds. 25 years later, each Victoria has become more of a burden than an asset. Maintenance costs have ballooned to the point where people joke that every voyage drains the budget dry. In some years, the entire national submarine fleet managed to keep only a single vessel operational, while the rest sat silent at port, rusting slowly like steel hulks left out in the weather, mute witnesses to their own decline, with no one daring to calculate their final days. Against the backdrop of a warming Arctic, where melting ice is opening new shipping routes and unlocking both economic and security potential, Canada, boasting the longest coastline of any NATO nation, cannot afford to step into the 21st century with an antiquated submarine force. This is not merely a technical issue, but a question of national stature. Without a meaningful undersea presence, Canada risks standing on the sidelines of a strategic chessboard where Russia, the United States, and even China have already marked their presence. In a sense, the Victorias themselves serve as a reminder. Clinging too long to outdated realities can strip a nation of its ability to defend itself. That is why replacing the Victoria class is more than just a procurement plan. It is a strategic declaration. Canada seeks to step out of the shadow of obsolete vessels and move toward a new generation of submarines capable of standing alongside allies and asserting its presence in strategic waters. And as the door opened to a $20 billion program, the next question grew increasingly tense. Who would accompany Ottawa on this journey? After multiple rounds of negotiation, only two contenders remained, one from Asia, one from Europe, each bringing not only expectations and technology, but ambitions reaching far beyond the boundaries of a single contract. After months of debate and careful screening, the final showdown of this contract of the century came down to just two names, each representing a different vision of technology and defense cooperation. From Asia, South Korea's Hana Oceans offered the KSS-3, a next-generation submarine equipped with modern lithium-ion batteries, allowing it to remain submerged far longer without surfacing to recharge. Its advantages lie in flexibility, endurance in combat, and above all, the promise of delivering the first vessel by 2032, a timeline considered reasonable given the Canadian Navy's urgent needs. Meanwhile, from Europe, German giant ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems presented the 212 CD class, already trusted and ordered by both the German and Norwegian navies. Powered by hydrogen fuel cell technology, this class operates with near-total silence, an unrivaled advantage in undersea warfare. Decades of German shipbuilding expertise also offered Ottawa reassurance in terms of quality and durability. Notably, both contenders pledged not only to sell submarines, but also to transfer technology, train personnel, and even allow parts of the production line to be established directly on Canadian soil. For Ottawa, this was not merely a choice between lithium-ion and hydrogen, but a commitment to a long-term industrial vision. A $20 billion contract would mean little if all of its value drained across borders. Canadians want to see new jobs in Halifax and Vancouver. They want shipyards lit up again. They want to believe that every defense dollar spent contributes to building national capacity, not just fueling a faraway industry. That's why the expectations placed on the two contenders extend beyond numbers like range, noise level, or diving depth. They also carry the promise of breathing new life into Canada's domestic economy. Yet, just as everything seemed to be unfolding within the bounds of fair competition between two international bidders, another force suddenly entered the scene. Powerful, imposing, and difficult to ignore. From Washington, the White House's voice rang out, not as a suggestion, but as an ultimatum to Ottawa. From that moment on, the game was no longer purely technical or economic, but a tense political chess match. What seemed at first like a purely technical matter, about technical briefs and promises of technology transfer, took a sharp turn the moment the White House spoke up. President Donald Trump, with his trademark blunt and forceful style, openly demanded that Canada award the contract to American shipyards. His reasoning sounded straightforward enough: protect tens of thousands of American jobs, from Connecticut to Virginia, from Pennsylvania to the struggling states of the Midwest. But behind those calls lay a hard-edged message. Canada should not entertain any illusions of breaking free from the machinery of the U.S. defense industry. The timing of Trump's statement only heightened the tension. Just days earlier, Washington had slapped steep tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports, sending shockwaves through the entire supply chain. Canadian factories, long dependent on the U.S. market, suddenly wobbled. In that context, Trump's reminder was like pouring fuel on the fire. It turned an ordinary bidding process into a loyalty test, forcing Ottawa into a corner. Comply, and Canada would preserve surface-level calm but sacrifice its autonomy. Resist, and the alliance risked a deep rupture. What truly ignited public outrage in Canada was the feeling of being strong-armed. History had shown that every time Washington tried to impose its will, Canadian resistance swelled. People remembered trade agreements that left Canada as little more than America's economic shadow, and the many times Ottawa had been forced to yield because it lacked the strength to fight back. But now, with a defense contract carrying such symbolic weight, this pressure felt far too blatant. It stirred a rare consensus among Canadian lawmakers, left and right alike, that this was the moment to assert sovereignty, to say something final and unyielding. And in that charged atmosphere, Ottawa delivered its surprise decision. Prime Minister Mark Carney, in a firm voice, declared that Canada would not allow its defense choices to be dictated by external political pressure. From that moment on, the story was no longer just about a $20 billion procurement. It became an open challenge to Washington. And that, too, marked the beginning of the next chapter, when Canada decided to say no, a resounding no, that rang out like a warning bell across the global chessboard of power. Prime Minister Mark Carney chose a moment of peak drama to deliver his message. In a live televised address, he declared with resolve, Canada will not allow its defense decisions to be dictated by political pressure from any nation. His words rang out not just as a political statement, but as a proclamation of sovereignty. Carney announced that the entire submarine program, worth around $20 billion, would be carried out on Canadian soil, split between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Halifax and Vancouver, along with shipyards that had once thrived with activity, would now become the centers of a new era. The decision sent immediate shockwaves. Within NATO's defense circles, an unwritten rule had long existed. Canada, even while developing its own industry, usually made room for U.S. participation in the production chain. This sudden break, keeping all the value at home, was like a sharp blade, cutting through decades of habit and shared interest. For Washington, it was a stunning blow. A close ally, once seen as an extension of the American defense industry, had now issued a blunt rejection. For NATO, it was an alarm bell. If Canada could do it, might other nations follow suit, choosing the path of autonomy? Inside Canada, public opinion erupted, but in support. People saw new opportunity. Thousands of jobs in shipyards would be created, billions of defense dollars would circulate directly within the national economy. Labor unions in Halifax, small and medium businesses in British Columbia, all hailed the decision as a triumph for economic nationalism. What began as a military procurement deal, Carney had transformed into a symbol of pride, of self-determination. But across the border, the atmosphere was entirely different. When the news broke, America's industrial towns, already bracing for lucrative orders, fell into shock. Groton, Connecticut, long hailed as the heart of the U.S. submarine industry, sank into a heavy silence. Workers who had dreamed of a golden season of endless overtime now faced the looming threat of unemployment. From soaring hopes, they plunged into a pit of despair, ushering in a new chapter of tragedy in this cross-border story. Groton, Connecticut, the land long hailed as the heart of America's submarine industry, had never witnessed such a freefall. In just one night, the jubilant posters celebrating a new production season gave way to a heavy, somber air. Workers who had eagerly prepared for overtime shifts and the promise of steady, generous pay suddenly froze when they learned that all the orders had crossed the border, swept into Canadian shipyards. Thick steel plates once destined from Ohio and Pennsylvania, sonar systems readied in Wisconsin, electronic components set to ship out from Kansas and Missouri, all were abruptly placed on hold. Thousands of working families were thrust into uncertainty. The small homes in this industrial town, which usually glowed with late-night lights during peak season, now went dark earlier than usual. Diners and shops near the shipyards, once bustling on the flow of workers' paychecks, found themselves eerily empty. People called it the overnight shock, a collapse without warning. From a dream of secure, abundant futures, the working community was hurled straight into a nightmare of job loss, lost income, and shattered faith in Washington's promises. Their pain was not just the loss of a contract, but the sting of betrayal. For years, they had believed the U.S.-Canada defense supply chain was unshakable, that the Northern ally would never turn its back. But when Ottawa chose to keep the entire $20 billion within its own borders, they realized that in the game of interests, even alliance could be pushed aside. And as sighs of despair spread across industrial towns, anger began to erupt in Washington. Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House alike were swept into a whirlwind of turmoil, where a single decision by Ottawa had morphed into a political earthquake at the very heart of America. The moment Ottawa announced it would keep the entire contract at home, Washington seemed to erupt. Congress immediately plunged into an unprecedented storm of arguments. Conservatives shouted that Canada had betrayed its ally, calling the move a stab in the back at a time when America was straining to maintain its global influence. They demanded the Trump administration retaliate at once, with tariffs and even political sanctions. Democrats, on the other hand, turned their fire back on the White House. They argued that the misguided steel and aluminum tariffs, compounded by Trump's heavy-handed rhetoric, were the very reasons Ottawa was forced to push back. In one heated hearing, a congressman even quipped, "We turned an ally into an adversary in the span of a single afternoon." While Congress clashed, the Pentagon could not sit still. Generals saw a widening gap in the defense production pipeline. The supply chain, long accustomed to U.S.-Canadian cooperation, suddenly fractured. The Department of Defense scrambled to reallocate funds, reshuffle schedules for other programs, and confront the looming risk of losing its strategic edge in submarine warfare. Internal reports piled up warning that a Canada shock of this magnitude could trigger a domino effect, sowing doubt among other allies. At the White House, the reaction was no less forceful. Trump denounced Canada's decision as unacceptable, threatening more tariffs and even cuts to bilateral cooperation projects. Yet behind the bluster, the truth was undeniable. America had lost a contract once thought to be guaranteed. This was not just an economic setback, but a blow to U.S. political credibility. And while Washington reeled from its internal storm, the world quietly watched. From NATO capitals in Europe to security partners in the Asia-Pacific, all eyes turned to Canada, trying to decode the hidden message in this bold decision. For it was no longer just a matter between two North American neighbors. It could well mark the beginning of a global upheaval. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, Ottawa's announcement struck like a bolt from the blue. European military leaders, long accustomed to seeing Canada as a steadfast partner bound tightly to the U.S., were stunned to realize there was still room for independence. Canada's decision did not bring immediate punishment. No aid cuts, no exclusion from the alliance. That alone set a dangerous precedent for Washington. Allies could, in fact, choose their own path if they had the will. In Berlin, Paris, and London, whispers began about localizing defense contracts, about reducing reliance on America's vast supply chain. With the war in Ukraine dragging on, Canada's move was a sharp reminder that industrial autonomy might be the safest shield of all. Across the Asia-Pacific, the shockwave spread just as quickly. Tokyo and Canberra, two of America's key security partners, looked at Ottawa and asked themselves, if Canada can keep a $20 billion contract entirely at home, might we be bolder in our own choices ahead? In Seoul, defense giant Hana Oceans felt the moment strengthen its hand. For many countries, Canada had just proven that the defense supply chain did not begin and end with the U.S. There was space for other suppliers, from Europe to Asia. And in Beijing, the news was followed with keen interest. For China, every fracture between the U.S. and its Western allies was another opening to expand influence. The world now watched Canada as it watched a rule breaker rewriting the game. Ottawa's decision may have been about a single class of submarines, but its ripple effects spread across the global strategic chessboard. It raised the question, could the alliance order Washington had labored so hard to build still hold its binding force, or would it slowly erode under the tide of rising industrial nationalism? And back home, that very question resonated even louder. Canadians not only saw the global impact, but also felt a change in their daily lives. With $20 billion retained to fuel local industry, faith in economic sovereignty suddenly became a new banner, flying proudly in the hearts of voters. At home, the impact of that decision spread more powerfully than any election campaign could. Canadians, long uneasy about seeing their tax dollars flow south to American contractors, for the first time felt clearly that the money would circle back to sustain their own communities. Major newspapers called it a victory for economic nationalism, a movement that had simmered quietly for years, now ignited into flame. In Halifax, dock workers celebrated the promise of new jobs. In Vancouver, young engineers eagerly imagined themselves helping to build modern submarines instead of seeking work in the U.S. In Ottawa, politicians saw a rising wave of support, for the decision was more than a defense contract. It was a symbol that Canada could stand firmly on its own feet. Through his decisive choice, Prime Minister Mark Carney had transformed the submarine deal into proof of a greater aspiration, self-reliance. Canadians believed this was not just about shipyards, but the beginning of a long-term strategy to build a defense industry with its own identity, free from dependence and outside control. In that moment, the spirit of autonomy ceased to be a slogan on paper and became pride flowing in the veins of every Canadian. From what began as a defense procurement decision, Canada has sparked a far wider debate about sovereignty, alliances, and the limits of trust. Washington, long accustomed to assuming that major contracts would inevitably flow back into American industry, now finds itself confronted with a stark truth. Even permanent assumptions can be shattered in an instant. U.S. workers are left in uncertainty. NATO has exposed a crack in cohesion, and other nations are beginning to glimpse a new path, that they too can say no to pressure if they have enough resolve and belief. The world is entering an era where economics and security are no longer tethered solely to treaties or alliance commitments, but are increasingly driven by industrial nationalism. Everyone wants to keep value at home. Everyone wants to build their own strength rather than rely on others. For Canada, this was a moment of self-assertion, proof that a middle power can make a historic pivot. For For the US, it was a wake-up call that power does not always equate to absolute control. And for the rest of the world, it was a sign that the global chessboard of power is being rearranged, one move at a time. Ladies and gentlemen, this story will leave aftershocks for years to come. But what do you think? Is this a historic turning point for Canada, or just a fleeting burst in the theater of international politics? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so we can continue this journey together, decoding the great shifts of our world.